What is a tesseract? Maybe that is not the real question. Maybe the real question is this. What if the universe has more dimensions than we think? And even though we are living right in the middle of those unseen dimensions, we simply did not evolve to notice them. Not being able to see something does not mean it does not exist. Sometimes it simply means we do not have the tools to perceive it. According to modern science, the reality we directly describe is spacetime, made up of 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. So in everyday physics, we describe the universe we live in as 4-dimensional. But there is an important distinction here. What we call a tesseract is not time. It is the geometric idea of a 4th spatial dimension. First, let's try to understand why we cannot understand the thing we struggle to imagine. And here, through Carl Sagan's elegant method, let's descend into a lower dimension. Welcome to Flat World. Let's imagine the world of 2-dimensional beings, a world that is completely flat. There is only length, there is only width, but there is no height, and no up, and no down. For the inhabitants of this world, the idea of looking from above is meaningless, because the direction you call up does not even exist in their universe. Carl Sagan in Cosmos uses Edwin Abbott's idea of Flatland for exactly this reason, to show why a lower dimensional world could never directly grasp a reality of higher dimensions. In Sagan's version of Flatland, beings live only within 2 dimensions. The 3rd dimension lies completely outside their experience. Now think about this. If you approached that 2-dimensional world as a 3-dimensional being, you would seem completely inexplicable to them. You could pass through walls. You could appear inside a room without using the door. You could look inside a closed object from the outside. And if you spoke to them from above, they would have no idea where your voice was coming from, because they would hear the sound, but they could not see its source. To them, this would seem like something beyond physics. Perhaps an invisible spirit. Perhaps a voice from the heavens. Perhaps even a divine intervention. But from your point of view, there is no miracle at all. You are simply moving through a dimension they cannot access. And that is the strangest thing about higher dimensions. Something that is completely natural in one dimension can look supernatural when viewed from a lower one. To see this even more clearly, imagine this. Let a sphere pass through the 2-dimensional world. But pay attention. The beings in Flatland could never see the sphere as a sphere, because the whole sphere cannot fit into their universe. What they would see is only this. First, a point. Then that point grows and becomes a circle. The circle keeps expanding, reaches its largest size, then begins to shrink again and finally disappears. To a 2-dimensional being, what happens would look like a mysterious shape appearing, growing, and then vanishing. But we know that this is not a circle being born and dying. It is the visible sequence of cross-sections made by a 3-dimensional sphere intersecting a 2-dimensional plane. That is the core idea in Sagan's Flatland explanation. A lower dimensional observer does not perceive the whole higher dimensional object, only the slice or projection that falls into their world. Now let's take this idea one step higher. We are also 3-dimensional beings. We perceive length, we perceive width, we perceive height. We can hold a cube in our hands. We can walk around it. We can turn it, examine it, and measure it. And most of the time we assume that this is the whole of reality. But what if it isn't? What if our 3-dimensional world, just like Flatland, is only a limited part of a higher spatial structure? This is where the idea of the tesseract begins. If you extend a line in a new direction perpendicular to itself, you get a square. If you extend a square in a new direction perpendicular to both of its dimensions, you get a cube. And if you continue the same logic, you would have to extend a cube in a new direction perpendicular to all 3 of the directions we are familiar with. What emerges is a 4-dimensional hypercube. In other words, a tesseract. In geometry, a tesseract is defined as a 4-dimensional hypercube. The famous image we see in 3-dimensional space, 2 cubes nested inside one another, is not the tesseract itself, but only a projection of it into 3 dimensions. And this is exactly where the human mind begins to stumble, because we cannot see that new direction. We say go right, and we understand. We say go left, and we understand. We say forward, backward, up, and down, and we understand. But in a 4th spatial direction, we cannot say, go there. We cannot point to it. We cannot mark it on a map. We cannot truly picture it in our minds. That is why the tesseract often feels not so much incomprehensible as invisible. And yet in mathematics, seeing is not always necessary. After all, we do not see electrons with the naked eye. We do not watch the curvature of space-time as if it were fabric in everyday life. But we measure their effects, calculate their consequences, and accept their reality. The same may be true for the 4th dimension. Perhaps we cannot experience it directly, but we can still follow its logical traces. And perhaps the most beautiful possibility is this. If 3 dimensions would seem divine to a 2-dimensional being, then 4 dimensions might feel just as transcendent to us. Something feeling mysterious does not mean it is supernatural. Sometimes it simply means that our perspective is incomplete. And perhaps that is the true beauty of the Tesseract. It does not only tell us about a 4-dimensional object, it also tells us about the limits of the human mind. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button, and share it with the people you care about, so the light of science can reach everyone.